It's the most iconic scene in all of cartoon history. Lucy Van Pelt holds out that football for Charlie Brown and essentially asks him, "Come on, Charlie Brown, why don't you kick the football?" Now, Charlie Brown's not an idiot. He knows that as soon as he goes to kick that football, Lucy's just gonna pull it away from him. Yet Lucy's convincing, and eventually she gets Charlie Brown to go, run after that football, and eventually Charlie Brown lands it flat on his back once again. The cycle, trying the same thing over and over and over again, and yet ultimately not accomplishing anything, is the story of the international community and its use of sanctions. Whether it be China, Iran, Iraq, Haiti, Cuba, or dozens of other countries, time and time again, the international community has implemented sanctions that have failed to actually cause change. Yet this hasn't changed their popularity. As The Atlantic writes on August 19th, in the United States alone, we have over 6,967 sanctions on the record. Now, the reason we have so many is because sanctions are seen as a good middle ground between outright declaring war and not doing anything at all. Yet, since we've invested so much time and resources into the implementations of these sanctions, it's important if we consider whether they're actually good things in the first place. Can they induce change? Or are international sanctions a poor way to influence change? And the unfortunate answer to that is yes, at least as presently constructed. They fail to be persuasive, they can actually cause harm to the countries implementing them, and they can have numerous unintended consequences. So, first let's understand that the purpose of sanctions is to persuade countries to change their behavior. And if sanctions fail to do that, then sanctions fail to accomplish their fundamental goal, and thus shouldn't be implemented in the first place. Now, The Economist writes on October 13th that sanctions can be successful in certain capacities if implemented with other diplomatic measures. Yet, as the Brookings Institute writes on October 1st, overall, international sanctions fail to be particularly effective, especially when implemented in a unilateral way. For instance, the United States implements a lot of sanctions by ourselves. Yet, ultimately, this means that other countries can just turn to other suppliers. So if the United States imposes a sanction, then ultimately that doesn't really mean much for an individual country, and thus it's not particularly effective. Beyond that, as the BBC explains on August 15th, sanctions lose their effectiveness over time. That's why we see Cuba, Iran, and Libya all deal with sanctions in the long term. After these sanctions have been implemented for several years, many people tend to forget why they were implemented in the first place, and these countries get better at circumventing them, and thus they lose their effectiveness as time goes on. And thus, in all of the examples that I mentioned previously, sanctions failed, and additionally, they fail to work when implemented unilaterally or in the long term. Thus, while sanctions can work within a limited capacity, that capacity is just that. It's limited. They shouldn't be used broadly or as frequently as the United States and the rest of the international community tends to do right now. That's particularly because sanctions can actually have a negative effect. And that's as a result of the harm caused to the country implementing them. What we have to understand is that when we implement sanctions, we're not just saying that the economic activity or militaristic activity within a particular country is decreased. Instead, we're preventing American companies or German companies or French companies or whoever it may be from dealing with what our country we're sanctioning. And as a consequence of that, our economic growth and job growth is reduced. As the Brookings Institute explains on August 15th, the United States has lost millions of dollars and thousands of jobs as a result of our sanctions. We could be investing in the countries that we're sanctioning, yet as a result of our sanctions, we are failing to promote job growth within the United States. Now, perhaps that's a sacrifice that's noble and well-meaning if sanctions can actually accomplish their goal. Yet, since sanctions fail to be persuasive when they're implemented unilaterally and in the long term, and need to be implemented very specifically and with other diplomatic considerations, for the most part, they fail to be effective as I previously explained. Which means that they're not just a net neutral, they're a net negative for the United States and any other country that implements them. But that's not all. The negative effects can spill over in other areas. This leads me to my third point, and that's the unintended consequences of sanctions. When it comes to sanctions, oftentimes they're entirely well thought out before they're implemented, which is why, as the Council on Foreign Relations explains, on August 5th, many countries suffer from these unintended consequences that simply were not foreseen by the international community. For instance, in Pakistan, after the international community imposed sanctions limiting the military access and supplies that were allowed into Pakistan, Pakistan relied more heavily on its nuclear program, which ultimately escalated tensions with India and wound up being counterintuitive to the implementation of sanctions in the first place. More broadly speaking, though, what tends to happen when sanctions are implemented is that a scarcity of particular products are implemented within a country. And as a result of that, the often authoritarian regimes that rule those countries have greater control over their populace. If an authoritarian regime suddenly has a monopoly on food as a result of sanctions, that authoritarian regime can actually strengthen its power while weakening the people, which is, again, exactly counterintuitive to the purpose of the sanction in the first place. And thus, when we look at the totality of the implementation of sanctions, we have to see that they aren't particularly persuasive, at least not in most instances and not in the ways that they're being implemented right now. Beyond that, they can actually cause a loss of jobs and a loss of economic growth to the countries that implement these sanctions in the first place. And third and finally, they can strengthen authoritarian regimes and have a wide array of unintended consequences for whatever countries may suffer from these sanctions. So, when we look at Charlie Brown and that football, it appears as though, unless the international community fundamentally changes the way they implement sanctions and when they implement sanctions, Charlie Brown is just going to wind up flat on his back once again. Thank you.